Okay, I have about 45 minutes to read before my daughter wakes up, and so we'll see how far I can get in this reading. This is from the history book, Christianity, the First 600 Years, for my Christian history or church history class, and chapters 4 through 7. We'll see how many chapters we get through. Unfortunately, I won't be able to make notations because this is a PDF file, and I'm really not an expert at, I'm not very good at making notations in a PDF. So I'm just going to read straight through it. And I'll let my comments be my notes on this text. So, Chapter 4, Ephesus, Edessa, Rome. The fall of Jerusalem, by putting an end to Jewish messianism, freed Christianity from the pressure exerted on it by Judaism and released it sociologically from Judaism. Paul won a posthumous victory, but the church had been too deeply entangled in the Jewish world to obtain release at a single stroke and find a new place in the Hellenistic world. In this sense, the period between 70 and 140 constitutes a period of search. The Judeo-Christian forms of thought survived, and Hellenistic Christianity had not yet produced the intellectual elite who would rethink them in the Greek tradition. It was also the period when, at the frontiers of Judaism and Christianity, Gnostic sects began to swarm, transferring disappointed messianic hopes into a fantasy world and condemning man's present life. Finally, the first clash with the Roman world was being prepared. 1. Asiatic Christianity. At the beginning of Book 3 of his History of the Church, after having described the fall of Jerusalem, Eusebius says that the inhabited world was divided into zones of influence among the apostles. Thomas in the region of the Parthians, John in Asia, Peter in Pontus and Rome, Andrew in Scythia. This statement contains a certain measure of historical truth, particularly for John, but it is difficult to verify for the others. One fact, however, gives support to it. The apocryphal writings of the New Testament are divided into cycles: the cycle of Peter, the cycle of Thomas, the cycle of Philip, the cycle of John. These cycles seem to refer to definite geographical areas, and it seems, in particular, that the Judeo-Christian mission at the beginning of the 2nd century took several different forms: the Mesopotamian, linked to James and Thomas; Asiatic Christianity, which depends on Philip and John; the Petrine group, comprising Phoenicia, Pontus, Achaia, and Rome. Asia Minor is the region where Christianity shows the most extraordinary vitality during our period. It would seem to be divided into zones of influence. The eastern part, Lycaonia and Sicilia, is the one about which we have least information. It retains the memory of Paul's preaching, later attested in the Acts of Paul. On the other hand, Phrygia is better known to us. In fact, we have a precious witness in Papias, who was bishop of Hierapolis in this region. Irenaeus tells us that he was a companion of Polycarp, and Irenaeus' evidence is excellent, for he himself knew Polycarp in his youth. Irenaeus also declares that Papias was a disciple of the Apostle John. It is possible that it may be the Apostle John whom Papias describes as the presbyter whose disciple he was. Papias had written some expositions of the oracles of the Lord, in which he had collected traditions about the apostles from the people who had known them. And he tells us, in particular, that he has heard the daughters of the apostle Philip speaking in Hierapolis. So we can believe as certain the information he gives us that the apostle Philip lived in Hierapolis. Later, the Montanist Proclus declared that it was not the apostle Philip, but the deacon of the same name, the person described in the Acts as having stayed in Caesarea, whose 4 daughters remained virgins and uttered prophecies. Polycrates of Ephesus at the end of the 2nd century confirms that Papias says, and it is certainly the Apostle Philip who died at Hierapolis. 2 of his daughters had remained virgins and also died at Hierapolis. The others married, and one died at Ephesus. Other facts seem to confirm his link between Philip and Phrygia. Other facts seem to confirm this link between Philip and Phrygia. This region is close to that of the Apostle John. It is remarkable that Philip plays a specially important role in the Gospel of John, written at this time, the end of the 1st century. Moreover, a Gospel of Philip has been found at Nag Hammadi. It is Gnostic in character and certainly a later date, but its contacts with the Asiatic theology of Irenaeus and Asiatic Gnosticism of Mark the Magus are very remarkable. There also exist apocryphal Acts of Philip, which praise virginity. Finally, it should be noted that Hierapolis received no letter either from Paul or John, whereas the neighboring cities of Colossae and Laodicea received letters. Perhaps this is because Hierapolis was Philip's fief. At the end of the period we are studying, Hierapolis became the starting point of Montanism. Papias saying that they come from the presbyters, gives us traditions concerning millenarian hopes, markedly apocalyptic in character, and it is from him that Irenaeus inherited this doctrine. Apocalyptic enthusiasm seems to have been one of the features of the Asiatic milieu, and we find it again in the heretic Cerinthus. The Apocalypse of John also shows signs of it. Asiatic Judeo-Christianity has a very special character, quite different from James's Palestinian Judeo-Christianity or Peter's Syrian group. Hopes of an earthly Messiah have here survived the fall of Jerusalem, and have not degenerated into Gnosticism. It was doubtless also this enthusiasm which made Asia Minor at this period the area in which we find most martyrs, along with the regions which had relations with it, like Irenaeus's Gaul and Tertullian's Africa. Under Domitian, Nerva, and Trajan, western Phrygia and the Asiatic coast appear to have been John's region. We have met John in Jerusalem, where with Peter he was one of the pillars of the church. He was present at the Council of Jerusalem in 49, but later we lose trace of him until his exile in Patmos under Domitian. It is possible that he was already in Ephesus when he was exiled, and it is certain that he stayed there after his exile. We have a witness O, the front rank, St. Irenaeus. A witness 0, the front rank, St. Irenaeus, himself a native of Asia, who knew Polycarp, a disciple of John. Irenaeus several times recalls the teaching of John in Ephesus. He says that he lived there until the reign of Trajan. Moreover, Clement of Alexandria records that he appointed bishops in the new Christian communities. Polycarp and Papias were his disciples. John was not the first to have spread the gospel in this region. We have seen that Paul stayed in Ephesus, but neither was Paul the first to bring the gospel there. I'm going to restart this paragraph. John was not the first to have spread the gospel in this region. We have seen that Paul stayed in Ephesus, but neither was Paul the first to bring the gospel there. He had found a Judeo-Christian community in Ephesus, and we know what difficulties it had caused him. It is this Judeo-Christian milieu which found in John its true direction, as Braun has noted. John belonged to the party intent on renouncing as little as possible of authentic Judaism. This attitude appears clearly in the Apocalypse, 2:14 and 20, where he violently condemns the Christians who agree to eat idolathites, meat offered to pagan deities. It is known that Paul took a less strict attitude on this point, and John seems much more in the line of Apollo. So Asia saw the growth of an original kind of Judeo-Christianity, in which millenarian hopes persisted. It was Asia that continued to celebrate the feast of Easter on the same day as the Jews. Literarily, the Apocalypse and the Gospel of John stem from this Judeo-Christian milieu, where Essene influences are evident. The first of these works is stamped by the upheaval resulting from the profanation of the temple in 70. The author sees in this the punishment of Israel, but keeps his eyes fixed on Jerusalem. In the Gospel, the theme of the temple remains dominant, but it is in the person of the Word made flesh that it becomes manifest. The counterpart of John's evidence is to be found in the epistles of Ignatius of Antioch. The latter crossed Asia at the end of Trajan's reign. The letters he addressed to the churches show the persistence of these Judaizing tendencies. In fact, they seek to curtail their excessive growth. These tendencies appeared in Ephesus. In Magnesia, they are more precisely described. The old fables referred to by Ignatius in the classic phrase used to describe millenarian hopes. The Christians do not observe the Sabbath, but the Lord's Day. It is absurd to speak of Jesus Christ and to Judaize. These Jewish tendencies prevented the conversion of the Gentiles in Tralles. The Judaizers taught that Christ was not really dead, a belief which stemmed from the millenarian dream. In Philadelphia, he had to be wary of those who interpreted Scripture according to Judaism. We may note that this opposition to Judeo-Christianity was accompanied in Ignatius by urgent calls to unity around the bishop. We may wonder whether, especially in Ephesus, there was not a kind of coexistence between two communities, a Judeo-Christian and a Pagano-Christian. This Asiatic Judeo-Christianity is expressed in books 5, 6, and 7 of the Sibylline Oracles. Book 5 has a very marked Jewish character, but a definite allusion to the birth of Christ shows that it is Christian. Gefkin dates it to the reign of Domitian. Allusions to Egypt might suggest this, but there is also an enumeration of the towns of Asia: Pergamum, Smyrna, Ephesus, Sardis, Tralles, Laodicea, and Hierapolis. And the spirit is more Asiatic than Egyptian. Book 6 is markedly Judeo-Christian in character and shows affinities with the millenarianism of Cerinthus. The same is true of Book 7. The former dates from the beginning of the 2nd century, the latter a little later. The Apocalypse and the letters of Ignatius, Papias, and Polycarp provide a glimpse of the various Christian centers of Asia. The first we meet is Ephesus, where John ended his life, to the church where he was primarily speaking in the Apocalypse. He sets to its credit its past suffering, evidently an allusion to the persecution of Domitian, of which John himself was a victim, and adds that it detests the Nicolaitans, that is to say, Judeo-Christian heterodoxy, which is turning into Gnosticism and entirely rejects the Old Testament, but he reproaches it without having lost its fervor. 30 years later, Ignatius still recognizes in Ephesus the same supremacy. He praises its purity from all heresy and names its bishop, Onesimus. About 190, the bishop of Ephesus, Polycrates, says that 7 members of his family have been bishops before him. In 196, Apollonius attests the continuance of the Johannine traditions in Ephesus. The church of Smyrna already existed when John was writing the Apocalypse. One of the letters is addressed to it. But at the beginning of the 2nd century, it became specially important because of the personality of its bishop, Polycarp. He was bishop in 110, since Ignatius was his guest at Smyrna on a journey to Rome, and he wrote him a letter from Troas. A little later, Polycarp wrote to the Philippians when sending them the collection of Ignatius's letters. From other sources, we know Polycarp well, thanks to the writings of Irenaeus, who lived near him in Smyrna in his youth and speaks of him in his letter to Florinus. Polycarp was martyred in 155 under Antoninus. We possess the acts of his martyrdom. About the churches of the interior there is less information. The Apocalypse mentions Pergamum, and it is said that Satan's throne was there. This may be an allusion to the fact that the town at this time was the center of the imperial cult. A Christian, Antipas, had been martyred. Moreover, a Christian, Antipas, had been martyred. Moreover, the Nicolaitans had followers there. The same was true of Thyatira, where a Nicolaitan prophetess, symbolically designated as Jezebel, performed her works. The church at Sardis was more important. It was an old royal city, and later, in the second half of the century, it was to have a famous bishop in Mileto. Further inland was Philadelphia, where the existence of a church is attested by John and Ignatius. The former put the town on guard against those of the synagogue of Satan, who usurped the title of Jews. It seems that this was a reference to the Gnostic rebellion. Ignatius, on the other hand, warned against the Judaizers, who introduced discord. The last letter of John was addressed to Laodicea, near Hierapolis. The letters of Ignatius show us that in his day, the church developed south of Ephesus, in the valley of Meandor. There is a church in Magnesia, with a bishop named Damasus, and another in Tralles under Bishop Polybius. Again, Ignatius warns the Magnesians against the Judaizers. It is noteworthy that the letters of Ignatius make 2 points. On the one hand, they insist on the unity around the bishop. On the other hand, they attack the Judaizers. It would seem to be one and the same problem. So in Asia at this time, the Judaizing tendency appears to have remained very strong, which tallies with what we have seen in the case of Papias. 2. The Palestine Mission. After the fall of Jerusalem, part of the Christian community, which withdrew to Pella in 67, returned to Palestine and doubtless to Jerusalem. Eusebius says that until the siege of the Jews under Hadrian, there were at Jerusalem 15 successive bishops, all said to have been Hebrews of old family. All were circumcised. It is curious that there should have been a succession of so many bishops during such a short period. Carrington has suggested that Eusebius's list is that of the presbyters of Jerusalem, from whom the bishop was chosen. The number given by Eusebius suggests that there were 12 of these presbyters. It is possible that the Church of Jerusalem was governed by a council of 12 presbyters, of whom one was preeminent, an archaic conception of the community. At Antioch, Ignatius compares the presbyters to the Senate of the Apostles, which suggests that they too were 12 in number. Eusebius notes that the community of Jerusalem was entirely made up of faithful Hebrews. It included members of Christ's family, especially some descendants of Jude, who lived until the reign of Trajan. It is doubtless to this group that one must link the Epistle of Jude, markedly Judeo-Christian in character. So the Church of Jerusalem emerges as the survival of the earliest Judeo-Christian church presided over by James. This group was marked by strict fidelity to Jewish practices. In the middle of the 2nd century, Justin tells us that Judeo-Christians of this type still existed, but they do not seem to have found favor with the Jews. For Bar Kosiba later persecuted them as bad Jews. According to Epiphanius, Aquila, the translator of the Bible, met some Christians from Jerusalem in about 120. Hegesippus, who provides all our information about this group, was himself a member of it by birth. The Gospel of James, with its ascetical tendencies, doubtless stemmed from this group, about 135. With the Judeo-Christian Church of Jerusalem is linked the origin of the church in Egypt. It would be highly unlikely that Egypt did not have Christian missionaries. The reason we know nothing about them is doubtless that Egypt did not enter into Paul's sphere of activity, with which almost all of our documents are concerned, but depended on the Palestine mission. The first missionaries were probably Hellenists. The Epistle to the Hebrews, which is almost certainly Egyptian, has points of contact with Stephen's speech. There are fragments of 2 Apocryphal Gospels from Egypt. Clement of Alexandria quotes the Gospel of the Egyptians. Clement and Origen, the Gospel of the Hebrews. They would seem to be Gospels of 2 Egyptian communities, one composed of Hebrew converts, the other of Egyptian converts. The Judeo-Christian characteristics of these 2 Gospels are striking. The Gospel of the Egyptians in particular has ascetical features, like the condemnation of marriage, which is also to be found in other fields of Jerusalem mission. The part played by certain women in the Gospel, like Salome and Mary Magdalene, also seems linked with the Jerusalem milieu. It is noteworthy that the only mention of Alexandria in the New Testament concerns Apollo, whose baptism is of Palestinian origin. It seems also that Pentaeus, the first Alexandrian doctor, was a Judeo-Christian linked to the Palestinian group. He knew Hebrew. Doubtless, through him, Clement inherited Judeo-Christian traditions concerning James and apocalyptic doctrines. At the end of the 2nd century, at the time of the Paschal dispute, it was the Bishop of Jerusalem, Narcissus, who transmitted the Alexandrians' reply to Rome. Another feature seems to link Egypt and the Judeo-Christian mission, the structure of the hierarchy. Several 4th century authors, particularly Jerome and Ambrosiaster, say that in Egypt the bishop was only the head of the community of presbyters, one among them and chosen by them. This is the Judeo-Christian type of presbyterate, with the bishop presiding over the college. It is the organization we have found in Jerusalem. In Asia Minor, it was combined with the Hellenistic type, that of the bishop to whom are subordinated the deacons. The Egyptian organization does not necessarily mean, as Jerome suggests, that the episcopacy is not of a different order from the rank of presbyter, nor does the designation of bishop by the presbyters mean that he does not elsewhere receive consecration at the hand of other bishops. Also from the Palestine mission stems the Christianity which was later to be the sole survivor among the Aramaean Christian communities, that of Adyabin and Osroene. As regards the former, Eusebius tells us, according to the Chronicle of Adai, that the king of Edessa, Abgar, wrote to Jesus and that Jesus sent him Thaddeus. This legend anticipates events of a later century. It is Agbar the ninth, king from 179 to 186, who was the first Christian king of Edessa. But it seems reasonable to think that at the end of the 1st century some Aramaean Christians came from Palestine to Osroene and preached in the Jewish communities there. There is a trace of this in the fact that it was the Jew Tobias who received Adai, the Judeo-Christian missionary. We may also note that the Christians of Osroene celebrated Easter like the Palestine Christians and not like those of Asia. It would seem, moreover, that there is something in Origen's statement, recorded by Eusebius, according to which Thomas was the apostle of the Parthians, who at this period were masters of eastern Syria. The memory of Thomas remained linked to Edessa, where his body was venerated in the 4th century. It is at Edessa that the cycle of Thomas grew up, just as the cycle of Philip grew up in eastern Phrygia, and the cycle of John in Asia. This is true of the Acts of Thomas, which date from the 3rd century. The Psalms of Thomas, adopted later by Manichaeans, are partly 14 and following, Judeo-Christian works linked with Edessa and written in the 2nd century. The Gospel of Thomas, found at Nag Hammadi, seems related to the Judeo-Christian group in Edessa. We may note the important place given there to James, which suggests that the church of Edessa originated from Jerusalem. The Gospel of Thomas dates from the middle of the 2nd century. There exists another work which can probably be dated to the same period and comes from Edessa. This is the Odes of Solomon. Their Judeo-Christian character is certain, and they seem to belong to the end of the 1st century and to have originated in Edessa. The similarity between these liturgical poems and the Hodayoth of Qumran is striking. So these are certainly works that Judeo-Christian missionaries coming from Palestine, more precisely Essene converts, could have written. Another important work may be a product of the Edessene community and date from a little later. The work called Gospel of Truth, which some scholars consider a liturgical homily, has striking stylistic resemblances with the odes. This too probably comes from Edessa. It seems that it cannot be identified with the Gospel of Truth mentioned by Irenaeus as a work of Valentinus. Also belonging to the same milieu and period is the Song of the Pearl, preserved in the Acts of Thomas. It is likewise at the end of the 1st century that we find Christianity spreading beyond the Tigris to Adyabin. Here there exists a document which seems trustworthy, the Chronicle of Arbela, written in Syriac in the 6th century by Mishiha Zka. The gospel was spread in Adyabin at the end of the 1st century by Adai. Kale thinks that only Adyabin was evangelized by him at this time, and that the gospel was spread later by Osroene, but Harnack may have been right in thinking that Adai baptized a certain Pekhida, who was the first bishop of Arbela. This episcopate lasted from 105 to 115, and it seems that it was followed by a break. This was the period of Trajan's campaign against Chosroes in 116. In 121, Samson was consecrated bishop. He was martyred in 123. This evangelization of Adyabin at such an early date need not surprise us if we recall that an important Jewish mission had gone to this region in the 1st century. The king of Adyabin, Izates, and his mother, Queen Helena, converted to Judaism, were buried at the Jerusalem tomb, at Jerusalem in a tomb still visible today. It was in this Jewish milieu that the Judeo-Christian mission developed. It is noteworthy that the bishops of Adyabin in the 2nd century all had Jewish names: Samson, Isaac, Abraham, Moses, Abel. The bishop of Arbela, Noah, was visited by relations who came from Jerusalem, and it was from this region that Tatian came. And at the end of the 2nd century, he called himself an Assyrian. The Christianity of Adyabin was very strongly affected by Judeo-Christian tendencies. Did the Judeo-Christian mission spread as far as India? Eusebius says that Pantaenus undertook a mission to those parts and found there a Gospel of Matthew in Hebrew. We may suppose that Christianity penetrated as far as India by way of Judeo-Christian missionaries in the 1st half of the 2nd century. May we suppose? This is by no means impossible. Later tradition linked this evangelization of India with Bartholomew, and it is possible that Bartholomew had Arabia as his missionary field, and that as an extension of this mission, the gospel reached India. Pantaenus, moreover, was a Judeo-Christian missionary who came from Egypt, and this confirms what we have said earlier about the essentially Palestinian character of the primitive community of Egypt. 3. The Petrine Mission. A third sphere in the Christianity of this period can be labeled Petrine. At first it comprised the Mediterranean coast of Palestine, Phoenicia, Syria, and Sicilia. And the towns of Caesarea, Joppa, Tyre, and Sidon were very closely connected with Peter's apostolate. The Kerygmas of Peter, incorporated in the Pseudo-Clementine writings of the 3rd century, may be as early as the beginning of the 2nd century. They are Ebionist in character. What they tell us about Peter's preaching in Caesarea, Tyre, and Sidon has no historical value, but shows at least that the memory of Peter lingered in this region. The works of the cycle of Peter, in the strict sense, may also come from this part of the world. This is probably true of the 2nd Epistle of Peter, also of the Gospel of Peter. The oldest evidence for this work, that of the Seraphion of Antioch at the end of the 2nd century, and of the Didascalia in the 3rd, is Syrian. There we again find the themes, so dear to Syrian theology, of the descent into hell and the exaltation of Christ above the angels. The Apocalypse of Peter belongs to the same period and region, and is mentioned in the Muratorian canon and quoted by Clement of Alexandria in the Ecologiae Propheticae. It is also to the beginning of the 2nd century that the preaching of Peter, quoted by Clement of Alexandria, must be dated. These last 2 works are quoted by Theophilus of Antioch, about 170, which confirms that they belong to Syrophoenicia. The first part of the Acts of Peter is linked with this region, but the work known under this name and the Pseudo-Clementine writings that use it are later in date. The position of Antioch was very special and appears unusually complex from the start. The church there had been founded by the Hellenists, but very early on was made up partly of Christians holding James' views and partly of Pagano-Christians converted by Paul. The works from this provenance during the period we are studying seem stamped with Hellenist influence. That is to say, stemmed from a Judeo-Christianity different both from that of Palestine and from that of Asia. The Epistle of Barnabas shows in its very name that it originated in Antioch. It belongs to the same family as the Didache, and in its doctrinal part, it is dependent on a typically Judeo-Christian exegesis. The same is true of the Ascension of Isaiah, which uses the theme of descensus and ascensus, an extension of Jewish apocalyptic imagery. The 2 works belong to the reign of Domitian and show resemblances with the Apocryphon of James, discovered at Nag Hammadi, and the Epistle of the 12 Apostles, which is related to it. The same theological tendencies appear again in the letters of Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, at the beginning of the 2nd century. They too are related to the Eastern Syrian works, the Odes of Solomon and the Gospel of Truth. There was a flourishing Syrian theology at this period. Moreover, the letters of Ignatius attest to the importance in Antioch of the order of deacons, who are named with the presbyters in the hierarchy, but they also collaborated closely with Ignatius in his journey across Asia. Whereas the presbyters represented a collegial conception of the hierarchy, the deacons were the bishop's collaborators. This appears clearly in the case of Ignatius. The 2 groups had often been in opposition, which may be why Ignatius insisted on their union round a single bishop. It remains true that if the Church of Antioch was not typically Petrine, it had many ties with Peter. We have seen that he had stayed there at a very early date. The Petrine apocryphal writings were popular in Antioch, as Theophilus and Serapion show. The Ascension of Isaiah is the first work to mention Peter's martyrdom. Antiochene Judeo-Christianity thus appears as representing the Petrine position. We have also noticed its links with the Phoenician sector, which was especially dependent on Peter. The same links are to be found in the other regions which came under Peter's influence, and which were in communication with Antioch. Eusebius tells us that Pontus and the neighboring regions of Bithynia, Cappadocia, and Galatia were dependent on Peter. Other facts confirm this. The first epistle of Peter was addressed to the Christians of these regions. That may be the source of Eusebius's information, but this hypothesis is far from certain, since there is other evidence for the link. Pontus and Cappadocia are geographically an extension of North Syria, and it was in that direction that Syria usually expanded. In a letter of Dionysius, bishop of Corinth in the middle of the 2nd century, we see the links between Corinth and Pontus. Now Corinth was in Peter's sphere of influence. In the Paschal controversy, the bishops of Pontus were in agreement with the bishop of Rome and in disagreement with the Asiatic bishops. For Christianity in Bithynia under Trajan, there is an important source of information, a letter of Pliny the Younger. Christians were numerous in the towns and also in the country, and belonged to all classes of society. One point deserves special attention. Pliny mentions 2 deaconesses, ministrae. The word is applied to Phoebe, a native of Cenchreae, near Corinth, and probably does not refer to a hierarchical function, as it was to do later, in the 4th century. But it makes clear the active participation of women in spreading the gospel, and probably also in certain liturgical rites, like the anointing of women before baptism, as Clement of Alexandria describes. It is interesting to note that, according to Tertullian, in the communities founded by Marcion, who came from Pontus, women taught, exercised, and baptized. Greece was the great center of Paul's apostolate. The churches of Macedonia, Thessaly, and Athens were dependent upon Paul. Athens, at the beginning of the 2nd century, was a great center of cultural revival, in philosophy with Taurus and Atticus, in rhetoric with Herod Atticus. It is there that Quadratus presented Hadrian with the first apology, perhaps at the time of the emperor's visit to the town in 124. Quadratus tells us that in his day people healed by Christ were still alive, which suggests a rather early date. In Corinth, the memory of Peter was closely associated with that of Paul by the bishop Dionysius. It is evident from the letter that Clement of Rome wrote to the members of the church at the beginning of the 2nd century that there were links between Corinth and Rome, with which Peter and Paul were associated. The letter shows that the town was torn by discord, the presbyters against another party, perhaps that of the deacons. For the Church of Rome, we have no information for the period following the persecution of Nero. It was probably then that Mark wrote down Peter's catechesis. The list of the bishops of Rome given by Irenaeus shows, at this period, Linus and Cletus, who are mere names to us. Things change about 88, when Clement took charge of the church. We first come to know Clement in the epistle he wrote to the Corinthians about 100, where he speaks in the name of the Church of Rome. He records the existence in this church of presbyters or episcopes, and mentions the deacons twice. So the structure of Roman community appears very similar to that of the Church of Antioch. The bishop is both the first of the presbyters and the head of the deacons. Clement represents in Rome the same type of personality as Polycarp in Asia. Irenaeus tells us that he had known the apostles. Doubtless, he is thinking chiefly of Peter and Paul. This seems to follow from what the pseudo-Clementine writings tell us of these links with Peter. Moreover, the epistle alludes to the martyrdom of Peter and Paul in Rome. Clement is heir to their tradition. We may also note the Judeo-Christian character of the epistle. It appears in the importance given to the figures of the Old Testament, in the manner of the Jewish Haggadah. Clement calls Christ the well-beloved, as in the Ascension of Isaiah, and the epistle uses archaic Judeo-Christian midrashism. These features recall Phoenician Judeo-Christianity and seem to stem from the Petrine tradition, the two poles of which were the Mediterranean coast of Syria and Rome. We may also note that the words of Christ recorded in the epistle seem to come not from the written Gospels, but from an oral tradition. The same feature is found in the Didache and in the Epistle of Barnabas. This means not that the written Gospels were unknown to our authors, but that Christ's teaching was transmitted both in writing and in catechetical tradition. Another outstanding figure in Rome is known to us at the same period, namely Hermes. He says that he wrote his first revelations at Clement's bidding and lived in Rome until the time of Pope Pius about 140, the period at which he published the definitive text of his revelation, according to the Muratorian canon. Several points certainly bear on the state of the Roman community at the time of Clement. Hermes himself is a proof that there were prophets, a mark of an archaic community. The Ascension of Isaiah complained that prophets were disappearing in Syria. There are remarkable resemblances between the shepherd and the doctrine of the Essenes, belief in the two spirits, pronounced asceticism, the importance of angelology. Here we have a Roman milieu marked by Judeo-Christian asceticism. The hostility of Hermes to the deacons should be noted, which is another piece of evidence in favor of this theory. Little is known about the events in the first 2 decades of the 2nd century. Irenaeus' list records that Evaristus and Alexander were bishops at that time. It was under the latter, about 115, that Ignatius wrote to the Romans and extolled the dignity of their church. Under the pontificate of Sixtus, 115 to 125, discussions took place in Rome between Christians of Asiatic origin and the rest about the date of the celebration of Easter. Again, the complexity of the church in Rome at this date is evident. It is doubtless to this period that the work called Second Epistle of Clement, which is in fact a homily, must be dated. It presents a theology of the church rather like that of Hermes, and probably belonged to the writings kept in the Roman Church with the Epistle of Clement, hence its name. Telesphorus replaced Sixtus in 125, and died a martyr in 136. Archaeological discoveries provide additional information about the Roman Church at this period. The excavations carried out under St. Peter's on Vatican Hill show that in about the year 120 the memory of the Apostle Peter was already venerated there. It is even possible that it may be Peter's tomb, which has been discovered, but in any case it is certain that his memory was preserved there by a monument. The priest Gaius, at the end of the century, says he saw the trophies, tropia, of the apostles Peter and Paul on the Vatican Hill and on the road to Ostia. The fact that this monument is in a cemetery seems to confirm that it is indeed a memorial of Peter at Rome. The graffiti on the wall around the monument are also evidence that he was venerated there. That's the end of chapter 4, and that's all I have time for. Let me just make sure that it's working. Okay.